So before we start, quick introduction. So as I mentioned, I'm AJ Brush. I actually just celebrated my 20-year anniversary at Microsoft 2 weeks ago. Thank you. I, of course, started there when I was 15, a very early bloomer. So I worked actually in Microsoft research for 12 years, building user interfaces that involved AI. And then 8 years ago, I moved over to work on assistants, so Cortana and now Copilot. I'm the group product manager for M365 Copilot Chat, so the standalone chat experience that you saw in many of the demos this morning. Mary?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Mary David Passion. I'm on the engineering team that's building the underlying Copilot platform. So I'm really excited to tell you a bit more about kind of how all of that works and fits together. And I started off at Microsoft 14 years ago. I started off in the SharePoint world, so lots of familiar faces across this conference, which was really fun. I worked in SharePoint and OneDrive. I worked in permissions for a long time, so you'll see I get really excited about permissions. You'll have to pull me back a little bit. And then most recently, I've been working with hooking up Copilot to all of the knowledge in your graph. And so that's what we're going to talk to you about today.
Yeah. Fun fact, when Jeff showed that screen from him at one of those early conferences, Mary leaned over and said, "I was at that conference." I was very impressed. All right. So this is our agenda today. Before we get there, how many people have already tried M365 Copilot? You're going to have to wave your hands so we can see you in the light. Okay, that is a great number. My hope is soon it's going to be 100%. Maybe even, today, tonight, don't go to the reception. No, I'm kidding. Go to the reception, then go get Copilot going. All right, so we're going to start. We're going to talk about the architecture. We'll do a deep dive on components. And at the end, we'll go through some best practices. Now, I was actually curious, how many times have you seen this slide today? Is it 4? Is it 5? So I was a little worried first, but then I remember my comms people telling me repetition. You have to tell someone something 7 times before they actually get it. But anyway, I'm pretty sure you're aware that we're taking large language models. We're bringing the graph, which Mary will talk about in detail. We're meeting you in the apps that you know, love, use every day. And we're also making sure you have the full power of the web, so you have up-to-date information. You've probably already seen this slide, too. But this is really, really important to us, that we are leveraging all of the work over so many years that people have put in building a secure, compliant, respecting your privacy, and our responsible AI tenants. I'm going to say again, your data, it's your data. It is protected by our enterprise compliance and security controls, and we do not use it to train any foundational models. All right, so we spend a lot of time. Some of our favorite things is spending time with customers. And these are common questions that Mary and I and others hear. What can it do? How does it work? How do we know our data is secure? And then how do I get the most out of Copilot? So we're going to go through these 4. We're going to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. We saw some questions in the app already, so that is good too. So think ahead as we're going through this, and we'll have some time at the end for that. All right, so what can Copilot do? Again, I'm assuming all of you did not sleep through the 2 keynotes this morning, and you've been to several other sessions. But just so we're all on the same page, we've got Copilot Chat with graph grounding. We can add your work grounding, your work data, so you can ask those detailed questions. And then we can meet you in the apps, Teams, Outlook, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, many, many more. And then one place that we're really excited about with Copilot Studio, I know I have some Copilot Studio folks here to take your questions. There's been several sessions on those, so you can build your own extensions. So what you're going to see here, so this is graph-grounded chat, and I'm showing you all of the ones I can do. So I've chosen to help me write, and I'm going to pick this PowerPoint and go ahead and start drafting an email to my team. I'm going to come back and talk to you. You may have already noticed, because you're super smart, that the prompt that went into the input box is much larger than the suggested prompt, and that's going to be one of the things we talk about in getting the most out of prompting. So great, I'm going to get all of these ways in which we're going to sell our bicycles, some action items, all come through. And then I am going to expand the references. So we have this trust but verify motto. So the nice thing about a reference, you can go ahead, you can open it, you can say, Was that right? And we certainly found through our EAP programs and everything that people often start out asking questions that they actually know the answer to just to make sure if it's working or not. So I can go ahead and go through here. And one of the things we wanted to show you is the platform that Mary's going to talk about. It backs all of the Copilots, so across everywhere. So now I'm going to go ahead and do an action in PowerPoint and add a slide. And a much prettier slide than I could ever make. And I'm actually going on a big bike trip this summer, and I'm fascinated by that second bullet, that riding an e-bike provides physical activity with reduced perceived exertion, which sounds like something I can get behind. All right, certainly in this weather when it's so hot outside. Okay, so hopefully now you've seen the slides. You remember all the things that we've been telling you about what is Copilot and what it can do. And with that, we will pull the curtain back, and Mary will tell you about how does Copilot work.
Great. So now you've seen in the keynote, you've seen in a couple other sessions, all these different demos of what Copilot can do when you're in these different apps. So how does it actually work? And it can seem a little bit overwhelming, when you ask a question and something happens. It seems, almost magical. At some points, you can feel like maybe it's, scary. Like, how does it know so much? So what I want to do is break it down into a few core components, so that as you start to go to some of these deeper dives that talk about how do you control your data with Purview, how do you make sure that you can extend Copilot to meet all of your needs, you can fit that in the larger frame of what is it and how is it built. Okay, so what are the key building blocks here? It really starts with you as the user. And so you could be in any of the apps, and that's all being powered by the same Copilot orchestration engine. This is the platform team that I work on. And what it does, it hooks it up to the LLM. And so at this point, I get a lot of questions, which is like, isn't this just ChatGPT? What's different about it? And I think really the differentiating thing here, among many things, is the fact that we connect this to your data on top of all of those privacy, compliance, and enterprise-level security commitments that we make to you for Microsoft 365 in general. The other piece is it's not just connected to your data, but it's also connected to different types of skills. So we've built and tailored the experience within each of the different apps. So as an example, you saw in PowerPoint that you can go and create a slide. In Excel, you might be able to actually analyze the data in Excel, or you might be able to build other skills with things like plugins. So you can have a skill that creates a song for you. And so orchestration is not just about it's not just about chatting with an LLM. It's not even just about chatting with an LLM and some data. It's actually being able to get whatever task you want to get done. So those are the core components, but if you break it down in a flow, what does it actually look like? So if you imagine that you're in kind of the flow that you saw, AJ just showing you, you as a user might be in Bing or you might be in Teams, and you ask a question. And the first step is that this question gets sent to the Copilot orchestration engine. This orchestration engine lives within the Microsoft 365 service boundary, and the app connection to Copilot is via WebSockets. So for any of you who want to nerd out on how does it all connect and work together, it's WebSockets from the app to Copilot, and then from there on out, HTTPS. Now, I showed you the picture that shows that the Copilot orchestration engine takes your user prompt and connects it to the large language model. But that's not the first step. The first step is that within the orchestration engine, we actually have our first line of defense of many for responsible AI. So we check on input if you ask a question that might generate harm or that might be in some way a problematic query. I got this question during the Ask the Experts earlier today. I was like, what if I type a question? And I'm not even going to repeat it here because it was so bad. I was like, you didn't have to give me the specifics of your question, but okay, if you type that, Copilot would say that's not an appropriate question, and I'm just going to disengage. And so it doesn't even continue the rest of the flow. So that's step number one. But assuming that your prompt is not problematic, what it will do is the orchestration engine will understand what is it that you're trying to do, and what data do I need to go get, or what skills do I need to go execute to do what you're asking me to do. And so this is done in a pre-processing step called grounding. And this is where we connect the Copilot orchestration engine to your graph data. And for those of you who are developers and you see Graph and you're thinking the Graph APIs, I mean Microsoft Graph, the whole ecosystem, all of your data, your emails, your files, all of your contacts, Graph connectors, for those of you who are excited about extensibility, all that data that lives in Microsoft 365, and also the insights and knowledge that's generated on top of that. That is Microsoft Graph, and it also means that we inherit all of Microsoft Graph's security controls, so all of the role-based access to content. So there's another question that I always get asked at this point, which is like, how do we make sure that the LLM doesn't have access to data that I shouldn't have access to? And this is the answer here, which is that we're calling into Microsoft Graph on top of the existing permissions model. Now, your data might not live in Microsoft Graph, and so we have ways to extend. We can call, there's basically two different ways. You can call out into a plugin, and there's a talk actually right before this about how to build a plugin. You can also extend not just the skills, what you can do, you can extend the grounding data and connect it to the web. And I know there's a lot of questions about the Bing APIs and calling out to the web. This is going outside of the service, out of the service boundary. And so there's a lot of questions about how do I know that that's protected. And so if you look up our commercial data protection, it will tell you how we actually make sure that we send queries to Bing. We get public web results back, but we don't actually, Bing doesn't actually use that data. We still protect the data, and that can include the questions that you're asking, so that we're not training the model on that.
And is it okay? I'll probably pop in and say, this is also an admin control. Oh, and I'm not on the mic. Oops. Okay, I'll turn the mic on, and then I will say going outside that boundary to Bing is also an admin-controlled feature, so you can turn that off if you would like that feature to be off as well and stay inside the boundary.
Yeah. Now, once the orchestration engine goes and gets that grounding information, it says, I have enough information to answer this user prompt. We send your user prompt, your question, with that grounding data in a large modified prompt to the LLM, which I'll go in depth a little bit more in just a second. This is where all of the questions come, because you see large language model, and people start worrying a lot about where that large language model is and what it's actually doing, what data is it retrieving. So let me just land a few key points. As you can see from the diagram, but I will call it out again, the large language model is actually, it's a Azure OpenAI instance, but it is a private instance of the large language model that lives within the Microsoft service boundary. And so that means, I think there's some worry that data is somehow leaving the compliance boundary, but that's not the case. The other thing I'll say is that your prompts, the responses that are generated, the data that we send, none of that is used to train the large language models. And I know that's been said in a lot of different talks. Somehow it can feel like the large language model knows. And so I'm going to go over why it feels that way and how you don't have to worry about that. In particular, I just want us to walk away with, it's not trained on your data, it's stateless. So we're not persisting your questions, the grounding data, any of that in that large language model piece. And the other thing is that I told you there are many layers where we bake in responsible AI, and one of them is here, which is when we're actually generating the response. So we take the input that you've asked and the grounding data, we look at the output, and we actually evaluate if it's actually maybe potentially harmful content or problematic content. And so this is, again, one of many layers where we do this. The large language model then generates a response, which it sends back to the Copilot orchestration engine, but that's not all. It doesn't just send it back to the user. It actually goes into a very important step, which is the post-processing step. This is the step where we do a few things. One is that we go back and validate all of the citations and references. So what content did we use to actually generate that response? We go back and pull that content so we can then display to the user, here's the content that we used, here are the labels of that content so that we can do the right thing with the actual response, label it correctly. The other piece is there's actually another layer of RAI checks in this particular layer, which is the post-processing layer. And the final piece, which is really important for any admins here, is that this is where we actually do persist the actual conversation. So we take what you asked, the user question, and the response and the data used, and we actually store that as a message within Microsoft Graph. So that is within your tenant boundary, and that is where it's stored, which means that auditing capabilities, e-discovery, retention all apply there. And the last piece is that we then send the response back to the user. It could be a response. It can also be instructions on how to execute a command. And then the user sees the final result, whether it's inserting a paragraph, rewriting a section, drafting an email for you, or just responding to a question in chat. And this is that overall flow that you saw. And I just want to call out a few things here. The first piece is that I showed somewhat linear progression, where you asked a question and then we flowed through this diagram. The orchestration engine can actually iterate, so it can actually go back, get more information, and craft a response that actually does answer your question. And so even though this flow shows it linearly, it can actually get a lot more sophisticated than that. The other thing I want to just reiterate, it's all within the compliance boundary for Microsoft 365, with an exception of where you as an admin, as AJ was saying, give consent and opt into turning on the web plugin or turning on any other plugin. And this platform I showed for kind of the flow of a general, like I ask a question, we go get some data, but this is actually the platform that powers all of our experiences. So it's not only answering questions in chat, but then it's also doing some of those skills that let you actually create content in Word or generate a recap of a meeting in Teams. It powers all of those things, and it means you can actually plug into it. So the two ways that you can plug into it, the first way is with plugins. So there was a talk right before this. There is a lot of great content on how to build a plugin, and I really encourage you all to take a chance to actually try a plugin for yourself. Some of the walkthroughs actually have just a vanilla, like, Hello World type of, I think it's the Northwind Traders plugin. You absolutely should try this. Everyone can do this, and it really gives you a sense for, here is how Copilot actually works. You know, you get to create your app, you get to create a description that will help it understand when it should trigger, and then, you get to create a plugin, and then you get to actually create the description, and so you'll actually see how you can extend Copilot. Plugins give you the opportunity to actually extend what it can do. You can also extend, if you just want to extend what grounding data it has access to, you can use graph connectors. And Brian, who's sitting right here in the front, is giving a session tomorrow on the graph connector, how graph connectors work. I've got a lot of questions about graph connectors today, and one thing that I just want to point out is the story for graph connectors is, if you're familiar with graph connectors, exactly the same as how it works pre-Copilot. So if you just suspend your thinking about Copilot and just imagine, okay, this is how I build a graph connector and bring my data to Microsoft 365, then you can see how it can be used by the Copilot orchestration engine. Hopefully, this gives you a good overview of how Copilot works. It tailors to have specific skills and understand the context of what app you're using. But the question I usually get at this point is, okay, I get that the large language model is inside the service boundary, but I still worry, like, what are we actually sending the large language model? And how do I know what you're sending it? So let me talk about a key component, and that is retrieval augmented generation. I told you that we don't, well, I told you, and everyone else at this conference has told you, that we don't train the large language models on your data. And so as you saw in the flow, what we're doing instead is understanding what your user prompt is and going and getting that data in real time to then go augment it to the prompt. So what is it that we actually send the LLM? First, we send your question, and that's how Copilot knows what you're trying to do. The second thing we do is we send all of that grounding data. So we say, the user asked this question, and here's some grounding data that we thought was relevant for answering this question. And then we also send the chat history. And this might be maybe the missing piece for some people, because when you interact with Copilot, it feels like it remembers what you just asked it. So then people come to me and they're like, aha, I got you. See, it is remembering, but it's actually not. We're bringing that context in the actual prompt. And the final piece is, I told you, we tell Copilot, this is the user prompt, this is the grounding data, here's the session history. Those instructions that I'm talking about that we need to tell Copilot are actually given in the system prompt. So the system prompt is really important for ensuring that Copilot knows how to generate a response or create the command it needs to execute, or whatever it is that is accomplishing your task. It also has important guidelines, not only for how it should respond in style and tone, but also things like how should it respond so that it's making sure that its responses are citing sources, using that grounding data when relevant, and also not generating harm. So yet another layer of where we actually make sure that Copilot is acting responsibly. But it's not the only place that we actually put that in. So hopefully you saw in the flow, I get the question a lot of, how does Copilot generate responsible, accurate responses? And one of them is that grounding data. So we say, hey, Copilot, you should use this grounding data. But we actually do this check at a number of different layers in the actual in that walkthrough that I showed you. So the first piece was that pre-processing step. If you ask something really bad, I was trying to come up with a query that was really bad that I would feel comfortable saying on stage, and I decided that you can just imagine that. We just block those problematic user prompts. Then there's the system prompt that I just talked about, which is we actually give Copilot instructions. You should cite sources. Here are the grounding data that's relevant. And so that gives it instructions on how it should actually generate a response. We also have a huge dedicated red team effort within Microsoft that tries to anticipate potential problematic input or output. And so we run these classifiers. These are actually, the classifiers get run on the input, the grounding data, and actually the output to evaluate and calculate the harm of of the content being generated or input. And then the last piece is in post-processing, where we actually make sure that the content, the response that's generated has citations that say where it was generated from. So hopefully that gives you a very high-level overview of how Copilot works. And again, this is the same platform wherever you're using Copilot. Usually the question that I get at this point is, okay, now that I kind of get how it works and it's going and retrieving my data, how do I know that my data is secure? And what I like to tell people is that while Copilot is relatively new, Microsoft 365 is not. And one of the core components that we're leveraging is Microsoft Graph. And Microsoft Graph is all of your data, and it's the unified programmability model for accessing that data and intelligence in Microsoft 365. One of the ways that Copilot has access to that data is that you can actually select the file. So you saw in the example that you selected a file and said, hey, tell me more about this particular file. Or it can actually use Microsoft Search to go find the relevant content. And this is really important because people often wonder, how can I craft better prompts? Like, where is this data coming from? Why did it pick these files? And so what I like to tell people is it's trying to take your user prompt and find the best data. So a prompt like summarize my emails is okay, but there's not a lot that Copilot can do with it. But as you start to get more specific, you can help Copilot understand what you're trying to do and what content it should go find. And some of those best practices we'll talk about in a minute. And so these are some, when you think about what Copilot actually can access and controlling what data is used, that's a key part of it, which is that Copilot goes out and it finds the relevant content. Your files, your emails, meetings, and transcripts. The more specific you can be, selecting files if you know the specific file you're working on, or giving more information about what you're trying to do or what you're looking for, the better it can be. The other thing is that I think there's some questions about what is and isn't supported. Certain scenarios, I've heard a few people actually at this conference say, hey, what about shared mailboxes and delegate mailboxes? It's such a huge scenario. I would love to hear what isn't supported today that you want to see. This is one of the reasons I personally came to this, is to get that feedback, because we're trying to figure out what scenarios are most important to you. So since search is finding the most relevant data, again, it's only accessing the content that you as a user have access to. Okay, this is the part where I really get excited, because that conference that was many years ago, I was on stage talking about how permissioning and sharing work in Copilot, and not in Copilot, in SharePoint. And here I am talking about permissioning in SharePoint. And let me tell you, there are a lot of features, new features since then, that have helped admins try to evaluate what the current situation of their tenant is, how to make sure they're not oversharing content. So in addition to just the general permissions model, there's also a bunch of features with site restrictions, with ACL and access reviews, with information protection that I encourage everyone to check out. And so there's actually a couple different talks at this conference on some of the best practices. So when you think about controlling what data Copilot uses, really it's about making sure that users have access to the right data that they're supposed to have access to. And Purview also has capabilities for labeling your data and using that to actually, whether it's auto-labeling, preventing oversharing. When you're able to label that data, it helps you understand, helps the user understand as they're using Copilot, what was this response generated from? Is it sensitive data? Should I handle it differently? But it also gives you some control as an admin to understand, what data is overshared or not overshared. So this is a bit about just really controlling data in general that's used by Copilot. But the other question that people ask about is just security in general. And there's also a talk about Microsoft 365 security in general. And so people start asking questions about, multi-factor auth, and how do we make sure that there are no malicious actors that access Copilot. And what I like to tell people is all the best practices that apply to Microsoft 365 also apply to Copilot. And so that's things like you should set up multi-factor auth, conditional access policies for accessing SharePoint and Exchange, doing the access controls. All of that still applies to Copilot. The other thing that I want to also just remind people is this is also generally where people panic and they start reevaluating how the internet works and how requests are routed. I am not going to explain that to you, but I want to reassure you that you have already invested in making your tenant secure with Microsoft 365, and all of those investments accrue to Copilot. So it's things, Microsoft 365 is a multi-tenant service. It has concepts already, like logical isolation of tenant data. We understand where data is stored. We have commitments for how it's stored, protecting it in transit at rest. We know how to take a request from a user and route it to the appropriate servers. Copilot does not change any of this. And what does that actually mean? First, I always reiterate, you control your data, and that means that we are not training the models on your data, and that we still handle it with all the same standards that apply to Microsoft 365 data. You also know where your data is located. And where data is located really boils down to two things, which is where was your tenant created, and where are the services that available for, which geographies the services are available in. There's also the data residency commitments on top of these that talk about data at rest. And Microsoft requires that data at rest, so that's your stored emails and your files, is encrypted. It also requires that data in transit is also encrypted, and none of that changes with Copilot. Now, talking about data at rest, one of the things that I touched on earlier is that in that last post-processing step, we do persist your Copilot interactions. And this is good for the user, who then can go back to their session history to previous sessions, so it's exciting for them. And it's good for the admin, because it means that you can now audit have e-discovery, set up retention policies on top of those interactions. The Copilot interactions that we log are roughly the user prompt, the grounding data that's used to generate the response, and the response itself. And just to show you, to like prove that it's actually there, we have a screenshot of Purview. So like you can see in Purview, you can find the actual Copilot interactions. You can see which resources were accessed. And if you want to go ahead and set up retention policies, you can do that. Think about the Copilot responses, the interactions stored kind of like Teams messages. So if you and I are to have a conversation, we have a chat, those get stored as messages in my user mailbox and your user mailbox. We can delete them, but the admin can have that control to audit those messages and have retention policies and all of that on top of it. And so as you can see here, Teams chat messages and Copilot interaction is very similar. So that's it. That's the overall architecture of how Copilot works. If you walk away with nothing else, just know that these are the fundamental building blocks that make up that Copilot orchestrator. And this is the same platform that's used across all the different Copilot apps. It gets tailored and specialized by the app itself to say, hey, I'm Excel and I can create a PowerPoint, or create a slide, or I'm PowerPoint and I can create a slide. Or you, as a developer, can actually extend it with plugins. And I really encourage everyone to try, like, I can't stress enough. I just really feel like when you get in there and actually see how it works, it really demystifies a lot of it. So hopefully you can see how powerful it can be. So one of the things at this point is, it is very powerful. You can set it up to be powerful, but how do you get the most out of it? And what are some of the best practices for how you actually do that?
All right, before I talk about that, I want you to join me in thanking Mary, just to make sure you're still all awake. Thank you. I love the way she can break down that super complex situation into something hopefully very clear, and we'll be here, and we're working hard to give you time for questions too. But just so you know, when we do get those thorny questions, Mary is like the first responder, so we're very privileged to have her here today. All right, so some of you raised your hand when I asked who had used M365 Copilot. Probably if I asked, had you used any generative AI or LLM, I would get the whole room, right? The whole room. So now the question is, how many of you have written prompts that did not give you back the response that you really wanted? Yeah, okay, I've written really crappy prompts. Okay, half of you are honest, the other half, I guess you're just moving on. So what we did is put together some hard-learned lessons on prompting, and I will take you through that. There's also some sessions on this as well. And what we've realized, and Mary kind of alluded to it when she was going through, is specificity helps. If I just say, hey, tell me about my email, can't read my mind. It's like, which email? You have 20,000 unread mail or something like that. So what you want to do is clearly specify what you want with details. And often I think about this, about what I would say to a person, right? A new intern, a new employee, my child sometimes. I need to give specific things. So building on that, if we're specific, oh good, you can see the purple. Okay, if you're specific about what success looks like, you're talking about your desired outcome. Do I want an email? Do I want an image? Do I want text? Do I want a blog post? LLMs, they were trained on amazing amounts of data. They actually know what these things are, right? And so the more you give, the more you get. So talking about what type of output you want. What goals do you have? Are you trying to convince someone to act? Are you trying to summarize the action items? What do you want out of this? What's in scope? So we've talked a lot about grounding, but grounding is just amazing, right? And explicit grounding, when you tell it explicitly with which files, even better, although search works pretty well. The more explicit you are, the better. And again, what specific data points? I want to know when's the ship date, or when's the party, or whatever it is. This third one has blown my mind more times. So people send me prompts all the time. I can't tell you how many times someone will be like, AJ, this was amazing, it worked, and they send it to me, or now they'll share it to me using that feature you probably saw in Jeff's keynote this morning. Look and feel of the formatting. I mean, it's amazing, right? How do you want it formatted? How long do you want it? What do you want it grouped by? I mean, people like italicize the quotes. I'm like, well, that's cool. What tone or style do you want? Do you want it to be formal? We've started putting some of that straight into the Copilot. You saw that in some of the email and Word responses, but you can take this in many different directions. And then point of view. And then this last one, this is a real learning. Someone gave me the example where they asked, I'm not even sure, they asked, how many Nobel Prize winners work at Microsoft? But then they said, or tell me that none of them do. And then suddenly the model was not trying so hard. It really wants to please you. So as long as you give that out. So don't include this, or yes, I don't want that. That can really help. That can help the model. So let's give you, this is an okay example. It's a very simple prompt, right? List 10 ideas for a fun remote team building event. No joke, someone on my team actually used this prompt to get ideas for events in the Seattle area. It was amazing. She's like, oh, I planned it so fast. I'm like, great. But anyway, it's a pretty good list. It's not bad. But now let's elaborate. Say, list ideas for a fun remote team building event. Ensure that the list contains ideas that encourage collaboration, boost morale, and ensure a memorable experience for all. Include a brief, or please, we're very polite when we talk to Copilot, please include a brief description of each idea and the expected outcome for team morale and cohesion. Use bullet points, this is my favorite part, and add emojis. I went on a big little emoji fest when I first learned you could ask for emojis. I think my team did not appreciate that, but add emojis to visually represent each idea. So now if you look at that, you know, all of a sudden we have expected outcomes under each of them. They each get a cute picture. Number 8, their hidden talents, singing, dancing, and magic tricks, all of those things. So you get the point, right? So we're not actually, you might be sitting there being like, oh my gosh, now I gotta write a paragraph for every prompt. That's ridiculous. So I did wanna say, no, we've got your back. So you saw this in the video I showed, but what we've started doing as we've learned this, I mean, we're not going to fit the whole paragraph into the little prompt suggestion, right? That would be a lot. But we're right now actually experimenting worldwide with a bunch of them that do this elaboration. So if you click on create an FAQ based on the document, you're going to get this very long thing that tells you that you want to create it. We want clear headings, bullet points, all of that. Now, one of the reasons we decided, we had a choice, right? We could have kept that in the background, right? We could have had you click. We could have sent that as part of the system prompt. We did it in the foreground explicitly because part of this is helping people understand, providing examples of the detail and what you can do, because later you're going to write some other prompt that has nothing to do with creating an FAQ, but you might think, oh, this time I really want the italics, or I want that. So we're actually seeing great uptake for these, and feel free to send us feedback about them, but it's been really interesting to elaborate. So I'm going to do some key takeaways, and then we will take questions. So we really can't say this enough. We protect your data. We enable you to control that. As Mary said, we're building on years and years of work on the graph, on M365, policies, controls, access permissions, our tenant focus, data protection, data processing, residency, security and compliance, data usage, and we are very committed to responsible AI. If you take nothing else out of this talk, I'm also going to ask you, not just for M365 chat, but for all of Copilot, to turn on feedback. I can't tell you how many times we get someone saying, hey, something's not working, and we say, did you thumbs down it? And they say no, and we're like, it's really hard to help you. So if at all possible, please do turn on feedback. The next slide is about what data is controlled and how the admin has control. But what comes to us is the prompt, the response, and the comments, and back-end diagnostic data. So again, we take data privacy incredibly seriously. The data is stored and handled under our governance rules. When you submit it through feedback, it can only be accessed for approved use. You can go ahead and search on Microsoft Copilot feedback to learn more. This is what data is collected, what's opt-in, what the admin can see, and even improve before you send it if you want. But I cannot stress again, we were actually talking before this talk that one of the most fun things about working on M365 Copilot is it has felt like we're co-developing it with our customers from the EAP program to conferences like this, because we are figuring out where we can help the most through Copilot, and the feedback really does help with that. So with that, we're going to stay on this slide in case you want to take a picture or anything else, and we will thank you for your time and take questions.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks. All right.
Hi there.
Hi.
So we've heard a lot about all of the really cool ways in which Copilot can integrate with Microsoft applications. When do you think you will be bringing that capability to Power BI?
Dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. I'm like, sorry, I'm doing that thing where I'm trying to remember where we are in the world. That is a great question. So the question was, when will you be bringing that to Power BI? I do not think that Mary or I know the official answer to that question, but I will be happy to get your name after this and figure out if there is anything publicly shared on that topic.
Yeah. There is on the Whova app, under our session, you can ask questions. So
Yes.
I would recommend if you don't connect to this right after this, or you forget, just to post your questions there. We'll try to get to it. I know there were a couple questions already posted. Hopefully I answered some of them in the talk, but if not, we'll go back and answer some of those as well. So it's another spot if you're, you should feel brave.
I'm also going to take that as feedback that you would like to see it in Power BI. Okay, great. Is there more other hands for Power BI? Would like to see it in Power BI? Okay. So yes, you can also telling us things helps us too. Thank you. Okay. How about here? And then.
So on that diagram, Mary mentioned connecting the outside world, the being and the plugin, and the graph vectors, and I don't know why she didn't touch on that the Dataverse and Power Platform.
Oh, yes, I should have. Yeah, I should have talked a little bit about that. I think we have. I'm not sure if there are separate sessions on Power Platform. Do you guys know?
I think so. I don't know which one specifically.
Yeah, I don't know which one specifically, but yes. So there's multiple ways, and as you've seen in the demo, there are multiple ways to connect Copilot to data or outside of your organization. And so yes, that is another another way. We kind of evaluating how much time we had for this talk, and so we just kind of wanted to just frame it of like, here are the connection points. But you're right, and I actually realized when I drew my little bubble, I think you saw that. I probably for the next talk, it'll go over. I think the other little box I think is missing. So good eye for that.
Thank you very much. I heard everything you said. I don't want you to think I didn't hear what you said, but I did. My name is Dave Buckley. I'm a personal injury attorney, and I have been told through the various bar associations I belong to, including the American Association for Justice, which is a big national, as recently as 2 months ago at their midwinter convention in Austin, that we should not be uploading our client files to AI, and especially ChatGPT, because the medical records and private documents cannot be considered to be secure, and you have to maintain confidentiality. And so when I heard Jeff this morning say what you just said, don't worry about that, we're good. And I said, okay, well, that's different. So I'm hearing something different, because, and you have said repeatedly that, no, not a problem. And I just want to be able to go back to my people and say, I heard it from them, not once, not twice, but 3 times.
Yeah. No, this is such a good
repeat the question.
Yeah, the question here was about, I have heard that, across these sessions that it's okay to send these sensitive content, might be, health documentation or, personal information that shouldn't sensitive in some way, that the advice from these companies, right, is like, don't ever send that to AI like ChatGPT, and then we're kind of saying something else. I want to clarify a couple of things. ChatGPT is a separate product, and ChatGPT does not have any of the protections that I just talked about because it is not, it's a separate product. It gets a little bit confusing, and a lot of people have a little bit of confusion around the models themselves. So the models are the private instances, they're within the service boundary. So if you don't have any plugins and you don't have any web data nothing leaves the Microsoft 365 service compliance boundary. I do have a question about, like, especially like there might be some other regulations about how that data is handled. So I'd be curious to maybe chat afterwards and learn a little bit more. If you want to learn about how the data is handled for things like the web queries, we're not actually sending the files outside of the boundary for the web queries, but we would send like your prompt, right? So if you asked a question that had sensitive information in the question itself, that's where you should think about, like, you know, what is your company set up, and what do you actually want to, what plugins do you want to enable, do you want to allow, and how do you want to set that up for your users, what makes sense for you. But the data is still, any files that are in SharePoint, they're still within that Microsoft 365 service boundary. So that might be where maybe some of the difference is. So my question would be, why not? And it could be that, you know, it's leaving our tenant, it's leaving Microsoft's service boundary, and we can't control it. And so that's where I was talking about, hey, this is a private instance. So in that sense, like, it's not a concern. We've heard from customers that there's some data they never want AI insights generated on that data. You know, certain legal documents where rewriting the words changes the legal meaning of the document itself. And so that's an example where you wouldn't want that document to be processed in AI. And so that's definitely feedback we're hearing about how can we give admins more control over that. But yeah, I'd be curious to know, like, kind of what the challenges are, if there's specific regulations that are in question. It is kind of, tricky. Hopefully that answered.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Great question.
One of your slides back, you were mentioning some limitations on shared mailboxes, delegate mailboxes. What is the status of Teams group mailboxes?
The question is about Teams group mailboxes. If you're talking about the emails that get sent to the Teams group mailbox, today we're not going and getting that email from the group itself. So like with a team, you can set up and you can have, you know, chats within the team, and then you can also have files that actually technically live in SharePoint, and then you can also have that mailbox. Today we're not searching. When we search for email in particular, we're actually searching your email as a user. So if you subscribe to the group, then that email, you'll be able to find it because it's in your user mailbox. But today we aren't searching the group mailboxes. I'm curious to know if it's something that you would want.
Yes, because we're actually looking at using it with Power Automate to monitor a group mailbox for support emails and make decisions from there.
Yeah, good.
Oh, go ahead.
I think there's a good question there about, like, I know there are scenarios where you can configure grounding data, so I'm not sure on, like, customizability, if maybe there's some options there. But in terms of, like, the overall, like, out-of-the-box experience you get with, say, like, chat, I will say we're building new capabilities in the product, which will, you know, so for example, if you're in Teams, you can, you have the context of where you're at. You saw today, if you're in OneDrive, you can, like, chat with, like, the OneDrive documents, and so you could imagine there's kind of a pattern for that, but we don't support it today.
Yeah, I was just going to add again, we're essentially co-developing. So these scenarios, I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting is how many different setups and scenarios there are. And so it does help us to hear them. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I agree.
OK. Yes.
I'm a teacher, and
My
I'm
sister.
used to submit documents in a myriad of formats using some of your competitors' products. Is there any kind of universal type format that can be used to convert those documents into something that I can incorporate into the Microsoft graph?
The question is, if I'm using other file types, maybe that are not like Microsoft, like Office file types, for example, how do I take advantage of that in Copilot? The question. I mean, the first thing I would say is, like, if those files live in the Microsoft Graph, but I'm guessing they don't. Is that your scenario? Because it's a different scenario of where the content lives.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily live in Microsoft.
Got it. So the content does not live in Microsoft. Yeah, there's if you have, if content lives outside of Microsoft, there's really two primary ways and that you can have Copilot reason over it. The first way is that you ingest that data into the Microsoft 365 graph via graph connectors. Depending on the file type, we've tuned Copilot to understand, to really like work well with like Word, PowerPoint, the file types that we know, and we're really tuning the prompts to make sure it works well with that. So depending on the file type, when you ingest the content, it just kind of depends. Like, are you actually, when you bring that connector, ingesting the right data so we can actually answer your questions? And then the other way, if you're not going to do the graph connectors, is via plugins. And so plugins, when you actually ask the question in real time, will go out to actually go fetch the data and perform a command or use that as additional grounding data. I think probably the easiest way to get you a better answer to your question is to maybe talk through some of the scenarios. I'm just going to point to like two of our extensibility experts in the front here and just like defer you to them. But that seems like the best way if the content isn't already in the Microsoft 365 graph. There are, and I think also EDU scenarios are particularly interesting, so I'd be curious to know what the scenarios are there. My sister's a teacher, so I'd love to hear the education scenarios. So yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that particular scenario and if kind of existing patterns work or if it's something else.
Great, here.
Hey, thanks for your talk. It was really informative. So I have a lot of concerns about the data in our tenant and oversharing and kind of the state that we're in.
You are not alone.
And I really have a lot of fears about unleashing this stuff too soon. So is that getting ready for Copilot? Going to touch on like using purview and that sort of thing? Is that the talk you recommend, or are there other sessions here for people who are kind of having those?
Yeah, the question is about like, hey, my tenant is overshared. What do I do? Like and you're not.
Or might be, we don't know.
Might be, yeah. Or even just like, yeah, I don't know. Like, how do I know? And this is a tough spot. I mean, this was a problem before Copilot, and now it's just accelerating. I think, just amplifying the intensity around kind of making sure we solve it. Getting ready for Copilot is a good primer and just sort of like what are the prereqs for setting up Copilot. It'll also go into some of the nuts and bolts of like how do you actually deploy licenses to people and what kind of things, I talked about not just making sure that the content is shared with the right people, but also making sure that your tenant was ready. So things like multi-factor auth and conditional access policies. So it'll go through all of that. I recommend that for anyone who is in this journey, like to understand like what does it mean to be ready for Copilot, and it'll touch on some of those practices. Sanjoyan from the SharePoint team is doing a talk, I think it's Thursday morning, that's about SharePoint. So if you want to know, like, generally the concern I hear is around SharePoint files and SharePoint content. That'll go into a lot of the sort of advanced management and best practices for oversharing. And there also is a dedicated talk. I don't know what it is, but you can look it up. I think if you look up Purview, it'll be one of those. Specifically, if your tenant has Purview, there are a lot of features that Purview rolls out for getting data governance under control. But yeah, it's definitely it's a hot topic. And as I just said, you are not alone. So it's probably those talks probably recommend for most people here.
Access to Bing Chat is blocked at the firewall in my agency. Is Microsoft 365 also that Copilot can be blocked?
That, well, I don't know exactly your setup, but in general, we have seen situations where because of being outside that compliance boundary, so the question, was that Bing Chat is blocked at the firewall at his agency, and will M365 also. What we typically see is the concerns because, as Mary said, the M365 Copilot, the core part, when you don't go out to the web, is inside the compliance boundary. Often it is not blocked, even when Bing Chat might be blocked for a variety of reasons. So it's not a given. We also, sometimes it's also a journey to make sure that your tenant is in the right place and what's going to happen. So I would be happy to talk to you afterwards about more specifics or stuff we can provide to help. But those are pretty different because going to the web, by definition, is going outside the boundary, even though we do all the things that Mary was talking about with the data protection, which you can read about, and not, training or storing the prompts and the responses. It still is passing out of that compliance boundary. So different places have different feelings or settings for that web grounding or optional connected experiences setting.
So when do you use Copilot for M365 versus Copilot Studio versus Azure AI?
Well, that's a good question. So the question is, when do you use M365 Copilot, Copilot Studio, or Azure AI? Do you want to start? You want me to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of, the first thing I would say is that Copilot for Microsoft 365 comes with a lot of things right out of the box. And it's integrated, it's already integrated with the data in your organization. You already can extend it with graph connectors and with plugins, and it shows up in all of your apps. So I really encourage people to kind of try it out, see what it's capable of. It meets, if you're part of the private preview, it was pretty limited, but now it covers a lot of scenarios that people might have been building their own, essentially custom chat experiences around. You probably want to use.
Can I just add on to that? So it's an end user tool, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to sit down, you're going to use it, you're going to summarize your meetings, you're going to author things. It's in, as Mary was saying, all the apps that you know and use. And now Copilot Studio.
And Copilot Studio allows you to customize it. So there might be even more than just putting graph connectors, more than just adding a plugin, but actually, like you saw, I think the demo, if you think about that flow and then you go back to the demo and see where you're able to actually say, hey, I want to take this user intent and do this particular set of capabilities. Copilot Studio allows you to just sort of like that drag and drop, really easy, no code experience, customize those capabilities.
But you're really building another either Copilot or an extension for M365 Copilot using Copilot Studio. So Copilot Studio is an authoring environment, low code, that sort of thing, but you're building something, putting those blocks together.
And those will still, and that will still show up in your Copilot experiences. There are definitely use cases where you want to go even more custom and have your own homegrown solution. Full disclosure, I am from the Copilot for Microsoft 365 team, so that's not my area of expertise. But there's definitely a whole host of reasons why you might want to build your own solution and have a lot. It just kind of depends on the nature of your data, what are the use cases for your scenarios. But that's kind of...
You're saying for Azure AI. Then.
Sorry, for Azure AI. Yeah.
Azure AI is like even
Azure AI
more
is kind
custom.
Of on, even more. And so I think in the beginning, there wasn't any customizability in Copilot for Microsoft 365, and so people had to go that route. So now I think it's good to just take a look and see what is it, where is the data, what are the tasks that users are trying to get done, and which pieces work right out of the box or with some customizations on top of that, and they can just show up across the apps that you use, and which one do you really need to build a dedicated solution. And there are definitely use cases for that.
I have realized that we are at time. Thank you so much for joining us. Mary and I will be here for the rest of the conference.
Yeah, thank you so much.